Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today I'm going to take a look at some classic rock and metal albums with bad production. We're going to take a look at who produced these records and if it ruins the album. Let's get things started with progressive rock legends Rush and Vapor Trails, specifically the original Vapor Trails from 2002, produced by Rush and Paul Northfield. And, Rush have a few albums with questionable production, but this is definitely the most egregious offender in my opinion, which is a shame because I really like material on here, specifically tracks like Ghost Rider, Earthshine, One Little Victory, and more. And this was the band's comeback album at the time. They hadn't made a record since Test for Echo in 1996, and they'd been on hiatus since 1997. And this was meant to be, a statement record that Rush was back, and it starts off, pretty defiantly, right, with that great drum intro by Neil Peart. But the whole album just sounds overly compressed. Keep in mind we were at the height of, the CD loudness war of the early 2000s here. Nothing really has any room to breathe in the mix, I don't think. And of course, there's a major lack of Alex Lifeson guitar solos. It really bogs the album down for me, but thankfully Vapor Trails is one of those records where the remix actually improved upon the album tenfold. Listening to the original Vapor Trails compared to the 2013 remix version is like night and day. The 2013 version was produced by Rob Bottrill, and it's definitely an improvement in so many ways. It really feels like two different records as far as I'm concerned, and I typically don't take remixes or remasters into account when ranking a band's catalog, but if I did, then Vapor Trails would definitely have ranked higher on my list when I count down the studio albums of Rush. How about Hotter Than Hell by Kiss, their sophomore record? And, the first three Kiss albums all have really flat production, and, they pale in comparison to the pseudo-live versions on Kiss Alive, but of the three, I'd say Hotter Than Hell definitely sounds the worst. And, keep in mind, Casablanca records were still pretty new at the time, and Kiss were not quite the hottest band in the world yet, so the album was stifled by low-budget production from the duo of Kenny Kerner and Richie Wise, and, the band were pursuing a heavier sound as well compared to their debut album, which was released just 6 months or so before. So, the whole thing sounds like it was recorded in a garage. It sounds rushed. The material on those albums, of course, is timeless on those first three records, but the production and overall sound on self-titled Hotter Than Hell and Dressed to Kill all sound super dated, and I love tracks on this record, specifically like Got to Choose, Parasite, Going Blind, the title track, Let Me Go Rock and Roll, Watching You, Coming Home, Strange Ways, all great songs, but, live versions throughout the years are much more refined and not nearly as muddy or rushed sounding. Next up, we have Fly on the Wall by ACDC from 1985, the second and last album to be produced by the band members, but in contrast, the preceding Flick of the Switch, produced by the band as a whole, Fly on the Wall was instead produced just by Angus and Malcolm Young, and that was done in an attempt to capture the rawness and simplicity of their early work, and in that respect, mission accomplished, I guess. It's definitely a raw and aggressive sounding record, but it's hampered severely by the fact that Brian Johnson's vocals are buried in the mix, and his raspy vocal delivery can be borderline unintelligible at certain times. The guitar tones on this record are super weird as well. But is the album ruined because of it? I don't think so. This is still full of, great deep cuts, and the tour for this record was awesome. Really raw and stripped back was that tour, and it's just the production on this record that sucks, really. And while I enjoy songs on here, like the title track, Shake Your Foundations, Danger, Sink the Pink, Hell or High Water, Back in Business, and Send for the Man, I feel like the album would be much better if it didn't sound like it was recorded in another room. Let's talk about the 2002 reissues of Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman by Ozzy Osbourne. Story goes, in 1986, Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake sued Ozzy for unpaid royalties, eventually winning songwriting credits on Blizzard and Diary, and then subsequently, right, total coincidence, out of nowhere, a 2002 reissue was made of these albums, which replaced Daisley and Kerslake's original bass and drum parts respectively, with new parts recorded by Ozzy's then current drummer Mike Borden and bassist Rob Trujillo. The 2002 reissue also included new backing vocals from singer Mark Lennon and John Shanks, and this was a Sharon Osbourne decision all the way, even though she initially tried to pawn it off on Ozzy, right? It's an extremely petty decision here by Sharon to, cover up Daisley and Kerslake's parts here so they would not receive royalties on this new version. And nothing against the musicians that participated here. Ozzy always had a great band behind him and they were just hired guns, but for the love of God, man, keep Sharon away from the classics, please. And I fortunately have the displeasure of owning the 2002 reissue of Diary of a Madman, and once you find out that Daisley and Kerslake's parts were re-recorded, it just totally takes you out of the album. Next, And Justice for All by Metallica from 1988. probably the most glaring example here of production choices that don't ruin the album, but just kind of leaves you wondering what could have been. It could have sounded so much better. And of course, the famous story with this record is that Jason Newsted had just joined the band. This was his first album of the original material, right? Because we're not counting Garage Days on this. Jason Newsted in the band, replacing Cliff Burton, who passed away on the Master of Puppets tour, and they decided to turn his bass all the way down in the mix. Whether that was a creative decision or more hazing of Jason depends on who you ask, but the bass parts on Justice sound amazing live, and really add something to the material on this album when done live, which is otherwise very guitar and drum driven, which of course makes sense considering James and Lars were very much hands-on with the production of this album alongside Flemming Rasmussen. It's a great guitar-driven, thrashy record and the most progressive Metallica ever got, but, it would have been even better with Jason's bass turned up, and, just check out the fan-made remix and Justice for Jason, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Megadeth and the 2004 remixes and remasters, all of them, they just sound terrible compared to the originals, and the most frustrating thing is that these are the easiest Megadeth CDs to find, so I'm currently in the process of trying to swap out my 2004 mixes for original copies, which is not as easy as I thought it would be, but the 2004 remasters were doomed from the start, stripping away any atmosphere the originals had. Songs were changed, everything sounds robotic and lifeless, parts were missing or re-recorded, and they also feature replaced and sampled drum parts, unnecessary added intros, alternate vocal takes, and butchered bass lines, and just some of the most embarrassing usage of trigger drums you'll ever hear. And a lot of people did not like them when they came out because, they'd been listening to the originals for years. I did not grow up with the originals, so that was not my only option, but I can tell you that they are objectively better than the remasters, which just sound, again, abysmal for so many reasons, many more than I'm able to list here, but they don't do justice to the original records at all, in my opinion. And again, it's a shame that these are the easiest ones to find, out of the wild at a record store or on Amazon, and that sucks because, I'm trying to, swap out as many as I can for the original copies. I do have an original copy of Risk. I have an original copy of Killing Is My Business, which, thank God for that, but, it just seems like Megadeth could never get Killing Is My Business correct, they tried that with a few different remasters. They finally got it sort of right with the Final Kill from 2019, which is, I think, the best we'll get of that album, but back to the '04 remasters, simply put, they sound like garbage, and you don't have to be an audiophile to hear why. Back to Metallica here with Death Magnetic from 2008, produced by Rick Rubin, and, Rick Rubin is, for the most part, a great producer. I love his stuff with Slayer, Danzig, System of a Down, and Johnny Cash, but he doesn't hit a home run every time, as seen with Death Magnetic. This was Metallica's much-needed return to a more, classic thrash metal-oriented sound after Saint Anger, and as much as I enjoy the material on this album, tracks like That Was Just Your Life, The End of the Line, The Day That Never Comes, All Nightmare Long, Cyanide, Unforgiven 3, and The Judas Kiss, the album can really be a tough listen all the way through due to some of the choices made by Rick Rubin and the band in the studio here behind the producer's chair. The snare is too loud and the drums are too high in the mix. Everything is clipped and nothing really breathes. Rather, it just kind of feels like one big wall of sound, which can be torture when trying to listen on headphones. And some of the tracks go on too long. You could have trimmed not just a couple songs off of here, but a few minutes off of some of the songs that I enjoy as well. And I appreciate the band's return to their thrash metal roots. I think it's the most motivated the band had sounded in the studio in years by that point, but it's basically a sonically boring record. Even during the quieter parts, everything feels too loud. The band pulled influence from their 80s records like Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning, but none of the playing on here has any room to breathe, contrary to the classic albums they were trying to replicate. And to be honest, I think the PS3 version ripped on Guitar Hero is so much better than the original on Death Magnetic. They should just reissue that. These weren't in any particular order, by the way, but lastly, we have Born Again by Black Sabbath from 1983. The album was produced by Sabbath and Robin Black, and pretty much the whole band were disappointed by the final mix of this record when it came out. The album sounds sludgy, but, not in a good way, not in the Sabbath sludge metal kind of a way, but rather just totally muddy. Ian Gillan's vocals are really strong, except for the off-screech here and there, which kind of sound like they were thrown in. The vibe of this record sometimes comes off as dark and menacing, which, works on tracks like Zero the Hero, Trash, and Disturbing the Priest, but otherwise I think sounds pretty dated. And was it ruined by bad production? I don't know if it was ruined. I wouldn't say so. I mean, personally, I love Ian Gillan's time in Black Sabbath. I think he did a killer job on this record, and his vocals were starting to peak here, right around the Born Again, Perfect Strangers era, but still sounds great. And in general, Born Again is a super underrated album in their catalog. Kind of a fever dream, right? Weird era of Ian Gillan singing for Black Sabbath, but I think it's aged extremely well in every department except for the production. You know, I mean, it sounds muddled, and for years, Tony Iommi thought that the album's master tapes were long lost, but in 2021 they were found, and so Tony's been talking about, you know, giving it a new mix for years, which I'd love to hear an updated remix. I think it can only improve upon the original here, and Tony did a really good job fixing Forbidden, which was a way worse sounding record than Born Again ever was, you know, but a Born Again remix would do wonders for the record, and you'll kind of like the recent Tony Martin box set, maybe reintroduce some people to a real hidden gem in the Sabbath catalog. So that wraps up this video here, taking a look at classic rock and metal albums plagued by bad production. You can see my picks right over here. They were in no particular order, but, you know, were these albums ruined by poor production? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. I'll leave that up for you guys to decide in the comment section below. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss a new upload. And until next time, this is the CD Guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.